Were you about to say something, Steve? Or
No, I was going to ask if you could yell goal for me, but it's okay.
Golfe!
No, goal! Like
Gol!
Goal! You've got that voice.
Gol! Gol! Gol!
Exactly. Goal!
Amazing! Fantástico, fantástico. Fala galerinha do canal da Cigar 019, sejam todos bem-vindos a um vídeo mas muito especial. Hoje falaremos com Steve Saka, que é um cara que eu sou um grande fã pelo trabalho que ele desenvolveu ao longo de sua carreira e trazemos novidades das marcas agora presentes aqui no Brasil. Vocês querem saber qual é? Acompanhar esse bate-papo que vai ser imperdível? Acomode-se em sua poltrona e venha com a gente, porque hoje o vídeo está imperdível. Mas antes, é claro, diretor, roda a vinheta para nós. Bom, então vinheta rolada, hoje você está vendo já na tela que o nosso convidado é super especial, então vocês sabem que isso merece aquele like bem legal, super generoso e claro, se inscreva aí no canal porque hoje nosso bate-papo é com Steve Saka e o negócio tá tão profissa aqui, diretor, que eu tenho o roteiro e eu tenho um ponto eletrônico, diretor. Olha que ponto chegamos aqui, diretor. Tem um ponto eletrônico para que a tradução seja feita simultaneamente e não perdemos nada aqui das informações que o Steve for falando pra gente. Certo, diretor? Podemos continuar, então?
Yes, we can.
Aí sim, eu gosto do diretor que ele é multilíngua. Steve, welcome to Cigar 019. Ó, fantástico. Meu inglês é fantástico. Fantastic, my English, no?
Oh, thank you very, very much. I can already see that everything to me is going to sound like a football match.
Fantástico. Então, gente, lógico, vocês vão ver o material todo editado, tudo bonitinho aí, legendado. E, cara, pra mim, realmente é super legal ter o Steve, que é um cara que eu sou extremamente fã do trabalho dele. Desde o tempo de Drew Estate, vocês vão entender toda essa história que ele vai explicar aqui pra gente. Então, eu já vou aqui partir para a primeira pergunta. Steve, seu nome aqui no Brasil ainda é pouco conhecido. Mas no mercado norte-americano ele já é extremamente grande. Eu queria que você contasse um pouquinho pra gente a sua trajetória. Como que começa a carreira do Steve no mundo do charuto?
Yeah, first, I don't think that my name is actually that well known in the North American cigar market. I think that in the industry side of things, with all the tobacco people and cigar makers, I'm really well known. And I'm really well known with consumers that are like really experienced cigar smokers and are really into cigars. But I don't think that the average cigar consumer in America really knows my name that well. Are we translating this? I have no clue what's happening.
No, that's okay. I'm translating in the moment you're talking, translating is in my ear.
This is like the United Nations shit. This is like
this is professional.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right, I'm digging this already. I'm on board.
Translation. Yeah, all right.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, my trajectory is kind of peculiar. I mean, most people get into this business one of two ways, particularly as a white fat guy. The first way is they're born into it. They're part of a tobacco family or part of a cigar family, which I am not. The second way that most white guys who don't speak Portuguese and speak really bad Spanish, except restaurant Spanish. I'm really good at restaurant Spanish. I got restaurant Spanish down. They get into it because they're in the sales side of things, right? They sell cigars, then they kind of move up that way. I got into cigars just as a cigar smoker. I started smoking cigars in the 80s, and I quickly became very infatuated, almost just went down the rabbit hole. And I was very blessed in life. I had a company that I had sold, not a cigar company, not a tobacco company, very boring company. We did control system engineering. It was terrible. But I sold it for a good amount of money in the very beginning of the 90s. And that allowed me to retire, not like rich, but enough that I could afford ramen noodles for the rest of my life. And I ended up just getting more involved in cigars because now I had more money and more free time. And part of me getting involved was my going on my own dime to visit different factories in different countries and going to fields in Ecuador and Mexico, the Dominican, Cuba. And I had pretty much gone and visited all the factories. And I was spending a lot of money on cigars, and I was spending a lot of money on my travel as it related to cigars. So a friend of mine and I came up with this harebrained idea that we would start an internet website about cigars. And so we started this thing called Cigar Nexus. And at that time, I was kind of in my Cuban phase. So we wrote a lot about what you guys call New World cigars, but we also wrote a lot about Cuban cigars too. And it was essentially, I mean, by today's standards, I guess it would be considered a blog, but there was no such thing as a blog back in 1995. Nobody had come up with the word. And so we were basically using this website, not with any idea of making any money or having any advertisers. We were just trying to find a way to write off our cigar expenses so we didn't have to pay tax to the United States government. And that was our whole thing, was just a way to, hey, we spend so much money on cigars, let's figure out a way to not pay taxes on this money too. So we set up this company that was intended to just basically lose money. And we did that for about three and a half years. And then the accountant said to me, you can't keep just intentionally losing money. At some point, the government is not going to let you do this. You have to actually bring some money in and actually make it into a real business. And neither my partner nor I had any intention of doing so. So we just stopped doing it. We never had any idea of wanting to make it into some big, I mean, we were essentially the half wheel of the time, but we were half wheel 20 years before half wheel existed. And but through that process, I knew everyone and I had met everyone. And one of the people along the way that I had become friends with was a gentleman named Lou Rothman. And Lou Rothman at that point was the owner of a company called JR Cigar and Santa Clara. And they were the #1 seller of cigars in the United States market. And Lou approached me about writing a book about cigars and tobaccos because I wasn't actually in the business. So I had no commercial concerns. In other words, my opinions were my opinions, but there was no benefit for me to, I wasn't trying to sell anything because I had nothing to sell. And the other thing too is I really like to hear myself talk. And I even like to read my words even more. So I was a very prolific writer. And even though I'm not a talented writer, I'm a very good writer in conveying ideas and expressing them to other people in a written form. So he approached me about doing this book. And I was in his office in 1999, and we talked about the book, I don't know, 10 minutes. And then we just got into this big debate about the best hot dog and the best muscle car, and then Yankees versus the Boston Red Sox. And then like 2 hours later, he just looked at me and he says, "Why don't you come work for me?" And I'm like, "What do you mean come work for you?" He goes, "Well, I own the largest cigar company in America. You love all this cigar and tobacco shit. You like going to all these really crappy countries that I hate. There's some place for you here in this company." And I ended up, my first job in the cigar business was as a grossly overpaid executive consultant to JR Cigar. And what that did for me was, as before I was the consumer that was really super engrossed, here I am now working directly for the number one businessman in the United States for cigars. And as you guys know, being in the international market, about 70% of all the handmade cigars smoked are consumed in the United States. We are the ones that smoke long filler, large format, wet style cigars. Now, that has been changing more over the last 2 decades, but at that time, it was really pretty much dry cured, really crappy bundle cigars or Cuban cigars was about all that most of the international market ever saw. So it gave me an opportunity to work with arguably somebody that anyone that you speak with would refer to him as a genius when it came to the business of cigars. And what that did for me is it gave me an entirely different perspective. Because look, when you're the consumer and you're in love with cigars and you have all this passion, it really pops your bubble really quick. You know what I mean? When you run into the headlong reality of, oh, how does this operate as a business? And that's where I got my start. And I was working with Lou for 4 years. And then we got bought out by a company called Altadis, which you guys are all familiar with. Originally, JR was bought by Altadis USA, which then got bought out by Altadis SA, which then got bought out by Imperial, which now is some Chinese overlord somewhere that nobody will say who they are, is now the owner of all of that. So when they got bought by Altadis, I didn't want to stay because it wasn't where my passions were. So I ended up leaving, and I had a 2-year restricted covenant. That's where basically they pay you to not work because they're afraid you're going to go work for someone else, that you're going to make them money, and they don't want to lose that. So they basically pay you to not help anyone. And about 2 years after leaving Altadis, I got approached by Jonathan, Drew, and Marvin Samuel, who own this really little shitty company called Drew Estate. They made a lot of really bad infused cigars, and they were pretty much looked down upon by almost everybody at that point. And they asked me to come and work with them. And I said no. And then they said, well, what if we make you the president of the company? And I said no. And then they said, well, what if we make you the president of the company and we make you a partner and give you shares for no money in? And boy, I love that idea. I own part of a company and I don't have to pay for any of it. And that's how I ended up at Drew Estate. And that was in 2005. And basically, I joined Drew Estate when it was about a $9 million a year company. Was pretty much known as the wacky tobacco company. And we as a team then grew that company to become the #1 manufacturer of handmade cigars in Nicaragua, and launched a whole bunch of, we continued making all of the infused products and expanding those, but we also then started doing more traditional cigars. And we basically it was really a startup on the verge of bankruptcy that we turned into an amazing success story. In 2013, I had been there 8 years. At that point, I was CEO, and I was tired of it. I didn't like living in South Florida. I didn't like the weather. I didn't like the hurricanes. I didn't like living there. And my wife hated it so much, she moved back to New England 2 years earlier. So I just one day went in and said, guys, I got to leave. And, they tried to talk me out of it because it was stupid, because we were growing tremendously, right? We went from a $10 million company on the verge of bankruptcy to a $80 million super successful company that was on a track to be bought out by some much, much larger company. But it just felt like it was time to go. And I was ready to do something else. And also, I don't know, I didn't enjoy it as much because my days had gone from being in tobacco and cigars and blending and creating brands to dealing with attorneys and accountants and bankers. And it was just like, it just kind of sucked, to be honest with you. And I decided to leave. So that's the second time I quit. And then it was the second time that I got bought out because they bought my shares back. And it was the second time I had a non-compete restricted covenant where they pay me to not work for someone else and to not make someone else rich. And when that restricted covenant ended, I decided foolishly, at the age of 50, I was going to start from scratch and start a really small little family company and just focus on making cigars that I smoke, that I like to smoke, that I'd be willing to spend money on, a much higher overall grade of product. Not that we didn't make some high-end products at Drew Estate, we did, like Liga Privada. But, most of what we made at Liga Privada, what we made at Drew Estate wasn't for me to smoke. It was meant for other people that wanted to smoke acid or natural or ambrosia or all these other products, La Vieja Habana. And so I just decided to start this little tiny itty bitty company. And that was in 2015. And here I am in 2000, what year was it? 2022. So yeah, I've been actually making money officially in the cigar business for 23 years, or not making money. And I've been intimately involved in the cigar business since about 1991-ish. So long story, not that exciting.
No. It's a very, very interesting story. Mas, Steve, todos nós conhecemos o Drew Estate pela sua peculiaridade. E eu queria que você contasse pra gente, ele até contou um pouquinho aqui já sobre a Drew Estate, mas eu queria que ele falasse um pouquinho sobre como é trabalhar com Jonathan Drew e, além de tudo, criar a Liga Privada, que, é uma linha de extremo sucesso que está sobre a chancela de Steve Saka e Jonathan Drew pela Drew Estate.
So let's be very clear. Jonathan Drew is fucking crazy. Period. Just not even a question. He's insane. He's always been insane. He's a genius. He's incredibly creative. He's incredibly engaging. But I can't speak of the Jonathan Drew today because I haven't worked closely with him in the last 10 years. But the Jonathan Drew I knew was a hot mess. But let me say something about Jonathan Drew that made him very different than all the other people that have gotten into our business like him. He actually went to Nicaragua. He actually opened a factory. He didn't speak English. He didn't know how to make cigars. He didn't know how to buy tobacco. He learned everything as he went along. He didn't invent a dog and pony story that was false. He actually went native for all practical terms. And that was something that you can't help but respect. Now, I would argue that Jonathan Drew did it because he was stupid and didn't know any better. Okay. But it forced him to overcome hurdles that most people would never even think about. They would say, oh, that's too hard. That's too high. John just isn't smart enough to know it's too hard or too high. So he just runs headlong into it. And this personality trait is a rather unique one. And a lot of times, this is kind of what separates those people that end up really wildly successful from people like myself, where I'm very conservative. I'm very practical. I'm very organized. I'm very, you know what I mean? I always look at the challenges and I weigh the risks and I think of this. Where someone like Jonathan, no, he just bam, bam, bam. And then what my job was there was to get him to harness that creativity and to be the adult and to try to get him to understand when no is for his own good and when he should eat his vegetables and when he should be going crazy. And that was part of the challenge when I was with Drew. But there's no way I can't help but admire somebody that has that type of energy and creativity. But boy, he's a challenging guy to really work with. He really is. He's very, very special. And I say that in both the most positive and the most negative ways. It is what it is, but it was a really exciting time because you're at a company that has very little infrastructure, has these really odd products. They had been trying to make something traditional, but every time they tried, it failed. And that was one of the things that I was brought into the company for, was not only to be the adult and to try to just tamp down on things and, but also to provide the experience and the gravitas. I don't even know how you translate gravitas into Portuguese. Good luck with that one. But to be the rock that would set the fundamentals that are necessary in order for you to make a traditional cigar long-term, consistently, for a profit that you could basically serve the market. Before the Liga Privada, we actually had what I call a training wheel cigar. We had launched a brand called Chateau Real, and it was a decent cigar. I wouldn't say it was a great cigar. It was good, but it wasn't great. But we needed to do that exercise first so that we could train the pairs and to start working with tobacco in a way. Because one of the things that when you make the flavored and infused products, there's a lot of room to hide in those products from a tobacco perspective. Now, I will say in Drew Estate's case, we never used inferior grades of leaf, but you didn't have to worry about it being as precise because you always had the addition of the infusion that would provide an element to the cigar. But when you start making traditional cigars that people are going to smoke on the regular day in, day out, they become very intimate with the taste and the flavor and the smoking experience that it provides. And the challenge that you have as a manufacturer is, how do you take something that is inherently inconsistent? And that's what handmade cigars are. They're just naturally inconsistent by their nature. I mean, you're basically talking about something that's made out of an organic material, which is never the same, not just crop year to crop year, bale to bale, leaf to leaf. And you're then having it manipulated entirely by hand to end up with a product that goes in a box to a consumer that wants a consistent smoking experience. And that's a much different challenge to do that. And that's why ultimately very few companies really ever end up making consistent products. And it's one of the reasons why you see companies like Padron, or you see a company like Fuente, or you see a company like Davidoff get to where they are, because they have figured out how to do that. And when you're that small little company that's starving and desperately needs every single dollar you can possibly scrape off the ground, it's nice to have that as a moral compass, but the reality of the banking account and your obligations, they get in the way more times than not. And that was the challenge. So for me, Liga Privada was really, Liga Privada, when translated from Spanish to English, means private blend. That's all it means. And here I was president of a cigar company that I didn't like any of the cigars we made. For me personally, I didn't smoke any of the Drew Estate cigars. I don't denigrate the consumers that like acid or they like natural or they like these other brands. They're just not the type of cigar I personally smoke. So that whole Liga Privada project started off as just really a cigar for me. So I could have a cigar that we made in our factory that I, as the president of the company, could smoke in public and not be ashamed of. And that's how it all began. And I think for a lot of people think that Liga Privada was a home run hit out of the gate, but that is not true. When we first offered Liga Privada to the market, we offered it to 50 of our best accounts, and 30 of them or 20 of them told us no, they didn't even want it. They're like, why are you guys trying to make traditional cigars? You guys are the flavored guys. Stop screwing around with this, make more Cuba Cubas. And the first couple, 3 years of selling Liga Privada were quite hard. It was a very small production, boutique within a small factory, just done much differently. And then it was really around, I don't know, maybe 2009, and then 2009, that all of a sudden the product caught on. And I think one of the reasons the product caught on so well was because for a lot of people, it was the surprise factor, because they thought of Drew Estate and they thought of acid. So then when they would smoke a Liga Privada, they go, wait a minute, what is this? Who makes this? Really? They make this? You know what I mean? So I think it surprised a lot of consumers. And because it surprised them, they would then say, hey, Bob, you got to try this. You're not going to believe this shit. The acid guys, they make this. You know what I mean? And that's really kind of what kind of got it steamrolling. Liga Privada, it was a beautiful product. It really was. I don't know what it tastes like now, and it may still be just as good. I just don't know, because when I left Drew Estate in 2013, I consciously decided not to smoke it anymore, because consumers always ask me, well, they don't do it as much as they used to, but really in the beginning, they're like, oh, what do you think of Liga Privada? What do you think of Liga Privada? And it's a very loaded question, because normally when they're asking you that question, they in their minds are thinking in some way it isn't as good as it used to be. And I don't want to ever have that conversation, because, you know, if you say it's as good as it's always been and it's better, then they look at you like you have three eyes. If I say, oh yeah, it isn't as good as it used to be, then it's basically kind of like sour grapes. Like, oh, they can't make a cigar as good as when I was there, and I was, you know, the final say on the blends and the production and all of that. So it's kind of a lose-lose question, no matter which way you answer it. And so for me, I made the conscious decision to not smoke any Liga Privadas that were made after February of 2013, because that's when my last visit to the factory that's when I stopped running the factory at that point. Now, to my benefit, I left the company with about 7,000 Liga Privadas in my personal collection, because it really was my personal cigar. And and I still have quite a few left. The bad side for me, though, is all the ones I have now are 10 to 15 years old, and they're too mellow for me now. Part of what I liked about Liga was I liked the little bit of roughness that it gave you and the little bit of extra zip it had. And now all of mine are just really they're just mellow and they're smooth and they're very, very good, but they don't give me the same experience. I always preferred smoking Ligas with about 6 months to about 18 months of age. For me, was like the perfect sweet spot. And Liga Privada was and Liga Privada shocked a lot of people. I mean, they didn't expect it from the company. It became the hottest selling brand in the United States. It was named that the year I left, 2013. Maybe that had to do with me leaving. And it was 2013 and 2014. And a brand that used to be a very small, tiny little brand that very few people knew about is now one of the best-selling top shelf premium cigars in America. It's I don't know the exact numbers, but it's up there. It's a big brand in the United States.
Fantástico, fantástico. Essas histórias que são muito interessantes para que a gente entenda como funciona o mercado. E aí eu quero aproveitar, inclusive, que estamos com o Steve aqui disponível para que a gente troque essa ideia e perguntar para ele, já que ele citou esse período a mais do charuto, qual o tempo de não vou dizer envelhecimento, mas o tempo assim que ele acha que o charuto, depois de pronto, ele ainda vai aportar os sabores de quando ele foi desenvolvido?
Okay, so as a manufacturer, when we put it should be that when we put the cigar in the box, it should be ready to smoke. And really what ends up happening is during the production part of when we're making cigars, we have to do two opposite things. One, we have to dry the filler materials, the tripa, to make it work on the table. Simultaneously, we have to overwet the binders and wrappers to make them flexible and elastic enough for us to stretch it around the bunch and then for us to finish with the wrapper. So what you do is you have a cigar where the fillers are too dry and the wrapper binder are too wet. And what ends up happening is that moisture that's on the wrapper binder then gets wicked very quickly into the filler, okay? Because the filler then acts as a sponge. And what ends up happening is that cigar basically ends up what I call soupy. It's what other people will call sick, okay? And so when you initially make a cigar on a bench, it typically only tastes the way it should sort of taste almost the day of or the next day. But once you get 3-4 days into it, after it's been freshly made, it almost like, and particularly with the stronger cigars, the stronger they are, the worse they become. They almost become flavor free because so much moisture ends up being wicked to the center of the barrel of that bunch that all of that moisture deadens the flavor. So the first step after coming off the bench is for us to wick the cigars. And we put them in the cool rooms with the intention of taking out that excess moisture that we had to add and incorporate in order to manufacture it, for that to come back out of the tobacco so that the cigar is actually smokable. Now, if the cigar is a lighter material cigar, Cuban cigars, much thinner, smaller leaves, light materials. If it's a Connecticut shade wrap cigar with milder Dominican and lighter Central American fillers, it typically will only take 3 to 4 weeks for you to wick that moisture out. Now, if it's a heavier cigar, one that has much fuller materials, a lot of sun-grown tripas, Connecticut broadleaf wrapper, a heavy sun-grown Nicaraguan kind of, Corojo or Criollo style wrapper. Those cigars are going to need a minimum of 6 weeks in the cool room, and they may need as much as 12 weeks. Because ultimately, what you want to do is you want to get that cigar down to an absolute moisture content of at least below 13. I personally like to get them down under 12 because I know for the most part, I tend to make a lot of stronger cigars comparatively. So my cigars need a little bit more time. But once you go through that initial wicking process, whether it be 4 weeks for lighter style, 8 to 12 weeks for heavier style, that cigar should be ready to smoke. Now, as a consumer, cigars always do better if they're given a little bit more time. It's like lasagna, right? You have lasagna the day your mother made it. It's great. But boy, if it sits in the fridge for 3 days and all those flavors start to meld and blend, it's really just a lot better, right? And it's no different with cigars. So if you can afford cigars, just an additional 3 to 6 months, almost always universally, they will smoke better. Now, typically, though, what ends up happening is between the time that we pack it, between the time that we import it, the time that it's in the warehouse, by the time it gets to the retailer, most of like our cigars, they end up typically having that 6-month period. You'll notice that on all of our boxes, if you turn them over, they're date stamped. And the date on the bottom represents the youngest cigar in the box. Typically, the cigars in the box are often 2 months older. But the problem is that when you go to the color sorting table, you lose track of what cigar came from what half wheel. So, and you have them all on the table. So we always use the date of the youngest half wheel, even if there's only one half wheel amongst 30 half wheels that we're color sorting that day. That ends up being the date that ends up on the bottom of the box. But the reality is in almost every one of our boxes, the cigars are about 2 months older on average than what the bottom date stamp even represents. I think that that's a good point. Now, as far as long-term aging, that's a question of what a consumer wants out of a cigar. I mean, if you want a cigar that's smoother and rounder, then, if you take a heavy blend and you set it aside for 2-3 years, you're going to achieve that. You're going to achieve even more of that in 5 or 6 years. But it's a lot like a red wine. There's a point where it no longer gets better, and then eventually it peaks, and then it starts to slowly fade away and degrade. Because the longer you store that cigar, you're just eventually getting more of the essential oils that are in the tobacco are eventually being evaporated out of that tobacco. So it's a very individual, personal thing. I find that I enjoy most cigars if I afford them an extra year. An extra year to me seems to be ideal, but I can't ask the consumer to do that. They're not expected to do that unless you're Cubans. The Cubans, they've managed to make it to where, yeah, we're selling you something that isn't good to smoke now. Smoke it in a year or two and it'll be much better. That approach would never work with the US consumer. We're just way too in the moment. We would be very dissatisfied. But I think that most cigars do tend to do better with an additional year of aging on them. And the heavier blends will tend to age better long-term and will not deteriorate as quickly as the milder blends. The milder blends, very seldom do you have a mild blend that once you get beyond a year or two, there's really any improvement in any way whatsoever, regardless of what you and your personal tastes are. Heavier blends, though, like the Ligas that I have in my inventory, somebody else may just think these are the best cigars they've ever smoked. They just don't give me the experience that I want out of them anymore. So for me, they're overaged at this point. So it's relative. But yes, cigars, when they go in a box, should be ready to smoke. A year is probably a good rule of thumb. And anything beyond that, I think, is a matter of really personal taste.
Perfect. Até para trazer um pouquinho aqui para a nossa realidade também. Criou-se essa ideia de que o charuto, para ser bom, ele tem que estar extremamente envelhecido. Porém, todo charuto, não diria uma vida útil, mas ele vai ter um limite de envelhecimento. Acredito que, para você aproveitar a proposta de blend que foi feita para aquele charuto, correto é você experimentar um e depois deixar os próximos. Não sei se o Steve concorda com isso.
Yeah, so, what you're talking about is what we call in America right off the truck, ROTT, right off the truck. One thing consumers need to understand is when you get that new cigar, that cigar's been through hell travel-wise. Many temperature changes, many humidity changes, many elevation and pressure changes. So almost always when you get a new box, you're better served if you wait 3 days. Now, that's easy to say, impossible to do because we're all like children, right? And you get a new box and you want to open the box and you want to smoke a cigar. So I always say to consumers, go ahead and do it. Smoke that cigar because it's like telling your kids not to have sex. They're going to have sex, right? You can't tell them not to. So you say, hey, but understand that don't judge that box by that first cigar if you're smoking it right off the truck. And that's always true when a new product gets introduced to a marketplace, because as soon as a retailer receives that new product, they instantly like, hey, we've got the new whatever. They put it on the shelf. Everybody in the store decides, oh, I got to try it. And really, that's probably the worst time to try the cigar. But there's no way to prevent it. So I normally say to a consumer, smoke one right away because you're gonna, and then revisit it 3-4 days later after it's had a little bit of time to rest. And then from that point, yes, it's always an interesting study to smoke one, smoke another one a month later, smoke one 90 days later, smoke one a year later. And if you're happy with it, you'll just smoke them all. I mean, a lot of people, when they find a product that they really like, they won't just buy a box. They'll just always have a box coming in and out of their rotation. Okay. And in my case, I have a lot of consumers that smoke a lot of my cigars. A lot of my customers are really into my products, and they will have literally 20, 30 boxes of my various types of cigars that I make. And look, nobody, as a cigar consumer, nobody ever intentionally ages cigars long term. The way this happens is we're junkies and we buy more cigars than we can smoke. And then one day you look up and go, damn, this box is 3 years old. Oh, wow, this box is 4 years old. I got half a box that I bought in 1985. You know what I mean? And it just kind of happens as your collection grows that you end up getting more aged product as a result of it. But very rarely does a consumer with intent ever from day one go, I'm going to buy cigars and I'm going to age them. It's just kind of a natural byproduct of the fact that we all buy more cigars than we could possibly smoke, and we end up with aged cigars. Another thing I'd like to say on this topic, it's a little similar. When you buy a cigar from a retailer out of his humidor, almost always those cigars are always a little too wet, in my opinion. And the reason why they're wet is because most humidors, they have environmental controls that every time someone opens the door, they click on. So the cigars are constantly getting extra humidity. It shuts off. Somebody walks in the humidor, clicks back on. And, that happens, 20, 30, 40, 50 times a day. So oftentimes when you buy a cigar from a retailer that's in a box, particularly one that's opened, okay, and is on the shelf and you're pulling out singles, in my opinion, almost always those cigars are a little too wet. And the other thing too is the old adage of that whole 70% relative humidity, that was kind of developed in a time when all pretty much of what people were smoking were much milder cigars. They were smoking cigars that were made out of much thinner materials, whether they be Cuban or whether they be Dominican. Okay. So those cigars can be smoked a little wetter because their tobaccos don't hold the moisture the same way as the heavier cigars do. But as you start to smoke more Central American cigars with a lot of Nicaraguan and Honduran style fillers in them, those leaves are much thicker, and just the hydroscopic, and I don't even know what the word in Portuguese is for hydroscopic. What is that word? Because I'm curious now. Hydroscopic basically means it takes on the characteristics of the environment in which it's in. So what'll end up happening is these cigars will become too wet. Most fuller-bodied, richer, more robust style cigars, they simply smoke better drier. You're much better off at a 65% relative humidity than you are at a 70% relative humidity. Now, if you're like most of us, you can't do that, right? Because you have both mild cigars and thinner cigars in your humidor, thinner materials. I'm not talking about thinner ring gauge. And you have heavier cigars. So like my personal humidor, my walk-in humidor at home, I keep it right around 66 to 67 because I tend to smoke more heavier style cigars, and I find that to be better. But a lot of times a consumer is better served just taking the cigar out of the cellophane and leaving it on the table overnight, and just giving it a chance to dry a little bit, particularly when you start talking about smoking the heavier Nicaraguan style products that we manufacture today.
Uau, fantástico. Então, o umidor do Steve Saka, ele vai de 65% até 67%, 68%. E a temperatura é importante ou não?
So my humidor is between 65 and 67, like not 65 and 75, okay? 65, 67. Temperature is really not all that important. I know that we make a big deal out of it, but it really isn't. You have to understand, cigars are made, look, these factories where we make these cigars, it's 85 to 95 degrees all of the time. The biggest thing that you as a consumer have to worry about temperature-wise is you have seen these charts where it says if it's this temperature, you should use this relative humidity. Ignore those. It's nonsense. It's psychobabble, okay? And just common sense and experience will get you out of that. But when the tobaccos are warmer, they do tend to be a little bit more pliable. They do tend to be a little spongier, okay? So to keep a cigar set well, a cigar stays set well between really 50 degrees and 70 degrees, 75 degrees. When you get over 75, the tobaccos get a little more pliable, and it doesn't quite burn or smoke the same way, but it isn't a problem. The biggest concern that you have is that the higher you get up the temperature gauge, the more likely you are to get tobacco beetles. And that range between like 82 to about 92 degrees is about the worst. That's like almost the ideal temperature. Now, this isn't as big of an issue today as it used to be because we as manufacturers are much better at our fumigation. We're using much better applications of chemicals than we used to use. We're much more diligent about it. We also now have incorporated freezing of almost all the products, almost every manufacturer at this point, with the exception of some of the really small little Fabriquita Chinchillas type places. They all have a way to freeze before they ship. So we as consumers today do not have the tobacco risk that the consumers had even in the 80s or 90s. And anybody that smoked a lot of cigars back in the 90s will remember that this was a very regular problem that we as cigar smokers had to deal with, but it's become a much less of a problem today. In fact, I think most consumers today, they've never even seen a tobacco beetle. They don't even know what a borehole looks like. They have no experience with it at all, where if you were a cigar smoker back in 1993, we all knew what beetles looked like. We all had to deal with them. It was a problem for everybody. It's not as big of a problem. So temperature isn't really as sensitive. I think the most important thing, I think too many consumers, they get too caught up in anal about the humidity and the temperature. It's really not so much that. Your cigar is probably going to be fine anywhere from 60 to 70% relative humidity. Your cigar is going to be fine anywhere from like 45 degrees up to 90 degrees, higher risk, obviously, of beetles as you get up in the scale. The most important thing is actually for it to just be stable. A stable environment is the best environment, because when you constantly have huge temperature shifts and you have huge humidity shifts, that cigar is constantly expanding, contracting, expanding, contracting. And what ends up happening is it ends up weakening the binder. It ends up causing problems with wrappers that'll end up cracking. And even though it may not crack in the box, it'll crack when you go to light it, because that cigar has been expanding, contracting, expanding, contracting, expanding, contracting. And in the worst case scenario, you can actually see cigars, they'll get almost crinkle. You'll see almost a wrinkle in the cigar from that constant up, down, up, down. So I think the more important thing is to just find a place where you're stable and you're happy. And the other thing too is to not, and so many of these relative humidity gauges that we as consumers use, they just suck. I mean, you're lucky if they're plus or minus 5%. You know what I mean? So I think one of the things that I would recommend to the consumer is spend a little money, buy a Boveda pack. They're very accurate. Pick the one that's 67 or 70. Throw it in a Ziploc baggie for a day or so with your humidity gauge and see what the humidity gauge actually reads. So then it kind of gives you a benchmark. Okay, the pack is 67, but this gauge reads 72. All right, I know it's reading 5 too high. You know what I mean? And to try to get a sense of that. And what you will find over time is you almost don't need it anymore. You can just tell by how it feels and how it smokes. And just, you know, it's one of these things that when we're new, we really just way overanalyze. And then when you get to be old like me, I leave cigars on the desk. I leave them in the truck. I've got them. You know what I mean? You get much. It's like when you have the first baby. You're worried about everything that puts in your mouth and everything it touches. And by the time you're the fourth child, that child's feral. He's on his own. He can stick anything in his mouth. He tumbles down the stairs. He'll be fine. You know what I mean? You get less angst-ridden about it over time.
Perfeito, perfeito. Então, gente, resumindo a obra toda aqui, diretor, fuma! Fuma! Se preocupa em experimentar, em conhecer as coisas, que é muito mais interessante.
Sim, é.
But again, look, everything is so much easier today. You know, we used to have to mix distilled water with propylene glycol. We used to have to worry about mold. I mean, you don't have these mold issues like we used to have. I mean, everything between the electronic humidifiers are way more accurate. The Boveda packs are amazingly good. In fact, honestly, if you're a consumer out there and you have a desktop humidor, don't even screw with it. Just spend the money, buy the Boveda packs. And look, if you're really cheap, you can recharge those. If they get dry, you put them in a Ziploc baggie with a wet sponge and it'll suck the moisture back up. Over time, they don't work as well doing that. So you can only be cheap to a certain amount, but it's just not worth the grief. I mean, you spend so much money on these cigars. Why you say, oh, I don't want to spend $4 on this? You know what I mean? It's kind of crazy. So, but yeah, I think storing those cigars is much easier today. And I think the other thing that really hurts consumers, and I always say this to consumers, don't ever buy cheap humidors. Cheap humidors are never worth the money. They cause you more grief. Look, a humidor, if you really think about it, you know, like where I live, in the wintertime, we have like 20% relative humidity outside. So you're trying to keep your humidor at 65. There's a 45% difference from the inside of the box to the outside of the box. That has to be some heavy wood. It has to be really well made. Okay. And the other thing too is if there's any sort of cracks or holes, that causes just kind of waste your time. In fact, I always tell consumers one of the easiest ways you can check the seal on your humidor is to take a flashlight, turn it on, put it inside, close it, and then go into a dark room, a closet, and just look and see if any light shines out of it. That's a really quick, easy way for you to check if the seals are good on your humidor. But almost always these discount humidors, they're not worth the money. If you're not prepared to spend a couple, $300 at a minimum, don't do it. Just buy a Tupperware container that seals well. It'll take care of your cigars much, much better than a cheap humidor. Cheap humidors are just a waste of time and money.
Fantástico, fantástico. Ô, diretor, você viu que aqui eu vou rasgar o roteiro, né? Vai seguir esse bate-papo aqui, né? Mas, cara, é muito legal ter essas opiniões de pessoas que estão diretamente inseridas no mercado. Nós que somos apreciadores, às vezes essa parte técnica, por eles estarem ali na fábrica diariamente, fica muito mais fácil, muito mais simples. Então, resumindo a obra aqui, viu, diretor? Fuma. Guarda seu charuto ali, legal, um umidor bacana e tal. Hoje tem aí várias possibilidades, mas foi o que o Steve falou aqui. Zip, um Bóveda, se possível não recarregado, como ele falou, para deixar de mesquinharia, né, diretor? Achei fantástico isso. Eu gosto muito dessa parte técnica também. Eu acho super interessante porque às vezes as pessoas elas se apegam tanto em detalhes que elas não aproveitam o charuto em si, entendeu?
I agree. And look, this is where the internet is. It's your friend and it's also your enemy. You get so much information. And the truth is, you have to understand that somebody is perceived as an expert just because they know a little more than you. If they know a little bit more than you, then they're the expert. But the reality is, most of these people that write about cigars, they don't really have that much experience. Look, I have personally, at this point in my life, I've smoked probably about 115,000 handmade cigars.
Wow.
Yeah, it's what makes me this beautiful man that I am. Look, and that doesn't count the number of cigars that I've just clipped and lit and took a few puffs on and thrown down. I mean, there are days in the factory where I'll clip and light 100+ cigars. So I think that it takes a while for you as a consumer to become comfortable. I think that, and it's something, I think it's one of the things I always tell younger consumers, or I shouldn't say younger, but necessarily newer. You're going to fall in love with a lot of things that you're going to fall out of love with very quickly. And particularly in the beginning, it takes almost 10 years before you kind of get to the point where you start to really define what you like in a cigar and what you don't like in a cigar. It's not an overnight thing. And I know that retailers don't like this, but I always encourage the newer consumer to kiss a lot of girls, date a lot of them, but don't go crazy, because chances are you're in love with her now, but you probably won't be a year or two from now. It'll still be a good cigar, but it won't suit you the way it did suit you. And the things that you used to find appealing are no longer what you find appealing. it takes a while. And that's why you'll find that as consumers become more and more experienced, they tend to actually smoke less brands instead of more brands. They figure out what are the cigars that are to be in their rotation, that are the ones that they regularly enjoy. And then they'll sprinkle in an occasional this and an occasional that. Whereas it's the newer consumer who just, oh, I got to try everything. I want every piece of candy. I want to lick everything. I want to taste everything. It's a much different scenario. And I think that, and I think it's just, again, it's human nature. I'm that way with whiskey. I have gotten to a point in my life where I have like 6 or 7 that are regular bottles that I keep all the time that literally serve 98% of my needs. I still try new things, but I'm always judging them against the standards. Oh, is this better bourbon than a Basil Hayden? Do I like this bourbon better than Noah's Mill? Do I like this bourbon better than whatever? You know what I mean? And I think as you go on this cigar journey, you will find the longer you smoke, the more understanding of your own palate and what you like and you don't like will become. And I think you will find that your list of products that you actually go and purchase becomes, you buy more of it, but you buy less different ones. And I think that's just a natural trend. I think that's a natural trend for all of us as we grow older. And that's why when you hear about advertisers, they always want to hit that 30-year-old to 40-year-old demographic, because they know that when somebody gets to be my age, they've kind of decided what truck brand they like. And they've decided what, you know what I mean? They've decided, like, I know what hotel chain I stay at. It's not that another hotel chain isn't today better. It's just when I was trying all the whole hotel chains, I came up with an idea that, okay, this is the one I like the most. And you just end up in that chain. And that's the reason why you see today, there's so many 60-year-old men that just Padron, Fuente. You know what I mean? Cuban. It's just the way it works. And which for me, being a new cigar brand, is not good, right? Because I'm not getting that guy. That guy has already decided what he likes for the most part. But it's really odd because I'm one of the few young companies that actually gets a lot of experienced cigar smokers. And I think that's something that, and I always tell new cigar smokers that we may not be the best brand for them because our cigars cost more. And if you can't tell the difference, if you can't discern the difference, then you're really just wasting your money. You know what I mean? And it's one thing for me to tell you there's a difference, and but what am I going to say? I'm going to say my cigars are the best ever, right? It's what we all say. It's the same nonsense no matter what. So what you need is you need the consumer to be experienced enough that they can come to that conclusion without being told. They don't need to be validated by a magazine or by a YouTube channel or by a ranking. At the same time, though, we on the manufacturer side, we love it. Look, Dunbarton Tobacco and Trust is the only company to have, in the last 7 years, we've been in the top 3 cigar every single year in the half wheel consensus. There's never been a company that's done that. We're the only company that's been company of the year for 3 consecutive years, even though we're a little company. So look, it's not that we don't love the accolades, we do. And it's not that we don't use it to advertise, of course we do. You're trying to take advantage of everything. Because look, in the end, we're all selling brown and round and you light it on fire. So any little thing helps. But in the end, none of that really matters. What ultimately matters is what the individual consumer in their own bubble ultimately thinks. Because in the end, you are a purveyor of your own good taste. You know what I mean? I know what I hate oysters. I think they're disgusting. They're like snot on a shell. Okay? I don't get it. Millions of people worldwide absolutely love oysters. Are they wrong? No, they're not wrong. For them, they enjoy them. Me, I think it's disgusting. Now, charbroil them, love them. Deep fry them, love them. But I'm raw on the half shell. I'm kind of like, okay, yeah, it tastes a little like snot. It tastes a little like salt. It tastes a little bit like the vinegar or whatever I add to it. But yeah, I'd much rather eat that deep fried between a piece of bread. That's me. But it doesn't make me right. It only makes me right for me. And understanding that is also a big part of it. Understanding that there is no one perfect cigar that is ideal for everybody. It just does not exist.
Perfeito. Tá vendo, diretor, como é bom a gente mostrar os lançamentos, tudo aqui, falar para a pessoa que está assistindo. Experimenta, volta aqui e conta qual foi a sua experiência. Tá vendo, diretor, como é interessante isso? Fantástico. Era tudo que eu gostaria de ouvir nesse momento aqui. Muito legal. Steve, nesses 2 anos que você fica afastado, que a gente já está falando de charutos, de novidades, nesses 2 anos que você ficou afastado do mercado, a sua volta ao mercado é justamente em 2015 na PCA, ou na antiga IPCPR. Como que a cabeça dele trabalha na nova fábrica, em novas marcas, que nem a casa Sobremesa e Sim Compromiso? Como foram esses 2 anos para que ele chegasse ao mercado com essas 2 novas marcas?
So, I've had a luxury that most people haven't had in life. I've been bought out 3 times. Got bought out of my engineering company. And then I got bought out when I was at JR. And then I got bought out at Drew Estate. So I have had 3 periods in my life where I've not been able to work as a result of taking the big check. The first year is really good. I travel a lot. I fish a lot. I lose like 70 pounds, not even thinking about it, just because I'm more active and I'm doing more. But then I would always get bored, and then I'd be like, okay, I got to start working again. I used to think it was because I was a workaholic. I am a workaholic, but what I've come to realize now, having done it 3 times, what I really miss is I miss the misery and the chaos. I just like being overwhelmed, because when I'm overwhelmed, I get to bitch and I get to complain, and I just love complaining. It's one of my all-time favorite pastimes. I mean, I'm my happiest when I'm my grumpiest. So the grumpier I am, the happier I am. I don't know why that is. It makes me feel more alive. It makes me smarter. It makes me sharper. I just love operating under stress. And it's something that I learned after the 3rd time. I can't explain why I have this thing about me, but it's the truth. So for me, yeah, I'm happiest when I'm the most miserable. It's just the way it is.
Fantástico. E fala um pouquinho então para a gente, Steve, sobre o desenvolvimento da lógica da criação da sua própria marca, da sua própria fábrica, enfim, da sua própria produção, e dessas 2 marcas que em breve, inclusive, deve estar chegando por aqui, certo, diretor? Já tá aí batendo na porta, que é Sim Compromiso e o nosso queridíssimo Sobremesa, que eu tava fumando aqui, diretor, mas olha o que sobrou dele aqui, ó. Já foi. O bate-papo tá tão bom que já foi. Então, Steve, conta pra gente como foi desenvolver Sobremesa e Sim Compromiso, que é 2 linhas de charutos fantásticas. Eu gosto muito, particularmente.
Yeah, so Sobremesa was the first brand I launched at Dunbarton Tobacco and Trust. And part of that was twofold why I decided to do Sobremesa. The first reason was, so I had become so well known as the Liga Privada guy at Drew Estate, and that is the style cigar that I tend to gravitate the most towards. I've always been a very big fan of U.S. grown Connecticut broadleaf. I tend to smoke on the heavier side of the spectrum. I wanted to make a brand that was more elegant and more balanced and more refined and a little bit more classic, because I didn't want to make something that was a direct competitor to Liga Privada right out of the gate, number 1. Number 2, I think one of the things that really shows your talent as a blender, as a ligador, is being able to do different expressions It's very easy to always do the same thing over and over again. You become very good at it and you become known for it. But I've always smoked a wide variety of cigars. Even today, I still smoke Habanos. I still smoke mild cigars. I smoke large formats. I smoke small formats. And when I was at Drew Estate, I wasn't able to really do much of that because Liga Privada was so, you can only make so many products to sell. You know what I mean? You have to think about the business and the distribution of it. So I can create all these blends, but where do they fit in? How do you make a mild Liga Privada? It's counterintuitive, doesn't make sense to the consumer. So when I first started Dunbarton, the first cigar I wanted to make out of the gate was something that was not Liga Privada. I wanted to show that I wasn't necessarily a one-trick pony and that I could make something that was a bit more balanced, a bit more refined, a bit more nuanced, a bit more intricate. And this is not in a negative conversation what Liga Privada is. I love that style of blend. And in fact, one of the most popular blends I make today is in the Mi Querida line. Okay, Mi Querida, Triqui Traca, Umbagog, which aren't going to Brazil right away, but hopefully next year they will as they become more available. That's much more that kind of style of blending. But I wanted to do something that was really unexpected, and something where I wasn't living off as Dunbarton, I have never used my Liga Privada Drew Estate story as the reason you should buy my cigars. That's not my sales pitch to a consumer. I think it's lazy. I don't think it really is the best approach. I don't think that you saying, oh, well, I used to make this, but now I make that, and this is better than that used to be. I don't like that. It just doesn't ring true with me, because the guy that loves Liga Privada, he loves Liga Privada. And you can't be critical of it without being critical of that consumer, right? And look, we can have conversations about what's a good cigar and a bad cigar, and there's definitely bad cigars, okay? But when it comes to, oh, this is a good cigar, the question is it a good cigar for you? Is its strength right? Is its flavor profile right? Does it give you the type of smoking experience you want? That's an entirely personal thing. There's no right or wrong answer to that. As I said before, you are the expert of your own palate. And so I wanted to do something that was significantly different. I wanted to work with a really fine grade of Habano seed wrapper. I wanted to work with a finely textured one rather than a heavier sun-grown style one. I wanted to do a very complex blend. Sobremesa has 5 different filler tobaccos in it. So in Sobremesa, there's 7 different tobaccos from 7 different farms. It's a very intricate blend, and it's lush. I would say that like the Robusto and the Toro, I would consider them medium bodied. There's a couple in the line, the short Churchill, which is a smaller format. I think I have that here. It's it's like a 48 ring gauge by like 4 3/4, I believe, off the top of my head. And then the Elegante and Cedros, it's a little more powerful. I've actually incorporated a little bit of a Pennsylvania seed leaf into the Ligero. So those ones tend to be more medium full. The problem, though, as a blender or anyone in the cigar business, it's one thing for me to say, okay, when you smoke a Sobremesa, I think there's notes of cedar and cocoa and, cafe. And I think it's punctuated by like almost this telecherry peppercorn and the retrohale. Flavors you might end up getting some agreement on. Strength you rarely get agreement on, because strength is so individualistic to each consumer. Some consumers would consider Sobremesa to be a very strong cigar. Other consumers would consider Sobremesa to be a mild to medium cigar, and it's like with like chili sauce, right? Some people think, Tabasco is hot, and other people drink it like it's water and they want ghost pepper. You know what I mean? So strength is one of the hardest things to really define. But I personally, on a 10-point scale, I find most Sobremesas in my opinion, from mildest to strongest, sitting about the 5 to 6 on a 10-point scale. That's where I find them. I find them to be refined. I find them to be balanced. I find them to be complex. And these are all things that Liga Privada, those are 3 words, maybe complex apply to Liga Privada in its own way, but not really if you really think about it. It was a much more in-your-face, earthy, straightforward style, robust kind of tobacco blend. It's just a much, much different kind of cigar. And I wanted to do something like that. Now, I think for some consumers, I think they were disappointed because what they wanted me to do is they just wanted me to continue the Liga Privada lineage style of cigar. But here's part of the problem with that. It takes time to work those materials. I have to source them. I have to ferment them. I have to age them. I have to get them to where they need to be. And there was no way for me to leave Drew Estate in 2013 and then in 2015 instantly say, here you go. Here's a good Liga Privada alternative for you. Because if I were to do that, it would never have been as good as it should have been because I rushed the process. Where with a cigar like Sobremesa and the materials that I used to make Sobremesa, that was something that was achievable within that 2-year window. So I was also kind of living with what my tobacco availability and where it was in its own life cycle as to what I could potentially make. And you'll notice that I made the Short Churchill and the Elegante a year later. So I made the stronger iteration of it. And when I say stronger, it's just a little stronger. It's not crazy stronger, but just a little bit more. I made that a year later when those materials came online. And I think Sobremesa, what's really odd in our market, particularly in the US market, I can't comment internationally. We're in a market where brands die very quickly. We as manufacturers, we launch a brand. The average lifespan of a brand in the United States market is less than 2 years. And the reality is most of them is less than a year, and they're just still stuck on the shelves and retailers, and they're trying to get rid of them. Very few brands continue 3, 4, 5 years down the road, and even less brands go to the 10-year mark. And the fact that we are selling more Sobremesa today, even though we launched it in 2015, and the brand is now almost 8 years old, it kind of shows that there is a consumer for it. It does have a place. It is a consistent smoking experience. And that's something that as a cigar maker and as a blender, that's what you're ultimately hoping to achieve. It's very easy to make something exceptional in a bubble. Oh, I got this really great tobacco. I'm going to throw this blend together. I'm going to make 10, 20,000, 50,000 cigars. And then you go on your merry way. It's a much different story to make the same cigar every day, 200 days a year for 8 consecutive years, and for consumers to still like it, and for consumers to buy more and more of that cigar. And that says a lot about the quality of the product. And that's what I was hoping to do with Sobremesa. So Sobremesa was the first one. But I will admit, honestly, me personally, it's a little lighter than what I normally smoke. So for me, the most popular Sobremesas that I personally smoke, I tend to smoke more of the Short Churchill. And I tend to, one of my favorites is the Cervantes Fino, the 6 1/4 by 46. Honestly, I think the Cervantes Fino is actually the standout one of the line. I think it's the one that, like, when I smoke that cigar, the other cigars are great, but I think that particular Vitola is an exceptional cigar in that blend. Now, the bad part for me is it's the least popular seller because Americans tend to gravitate towards the much bigger ring gauges. In fact, in the United States market, and I'm seeing this more and more in the international market, you can make only 3 cigars. You can make a Robusto, a Toro, and a Gordo, some 60 ring gauge monster. And those 3 sizes, they account for 85% of all the sales. Everything else, Lonsdales, Coronas, Perfectos, Torpedoes, double Coronas, Lanceros, don't even talk about that. I mean, they account for all of them together added up are 15%. So those 3 sizes are the key sizes. And I don't know how it is in Brazil, but that is definitely the way it is in the United States market.
Okay, in Brazil, Robusto and Toro, the popular vitolas, and me, for example, I like so much the Robusto. You know?
Whereas I rarely smoke a Robusto because I always feel it's too short. And unlike so many other people, they're trying to smoke their cigar at the end of their day, and they're trying to get it in between going to bed and the kids going to bed, and they're just trying to find 45 minutes, an hour maybe. I smoke 10 cigars every day. So
Yeah.
I wake up, I'm smoking cigars. I'm smoking cigars till I go to sleep at night. I can smoke in my office. I can smoke in my truck. I can smoke in my house. I smoke everywhere. Okay. If they would let me smoke at the dentist office, I'd be smoking there too while they're working on my teeth. But I can't convince her that it's okay. But I and that's, that's a benefit that I live in a smoking environment. But most people don't. But what that means is I rarely grab a Robusto because I don't need it to fit into a time window.
Fantástico. E até aproveitando que o papo partiu para essas questões de blends, enfim, eu queria saber do Steve, por que a escolha da joia de Nicarágua? Como é trabalhar com a joia de Nicarágua na produção dos charutos da marca dele?
Okay, so let me explain the cigar factory to you. I know for most people, they look at the part of where we make the cigar as very romantic.
Sim,
The reality is a factory is a place where they take perfectly good tobacco and they fuck it up. That's what a factory does. You can make cigars anywhere. All you need to make cigars is a table, a cutting board, and a knife. Okay? You don't even need the molds. I can do it in newspaper. Okay? So a factory is about operations. It's about quality control. It's about standards. It's about practices. It's about methodology. It's about consistency. These are the things that separate a really good factory from a bad factory. Okay. And that's something that for me, the Hoya guys are really very, very good at. Now, they weren't. When I first started working with Hoya, because I started working with Hoya back in, I don't know, 2007 or 8 when Drew Estate took over the distribution in the United States. With them, they were very much like most factories. They weren't as well organized. They were a little sloppy. Over time, they have become, in my opinion, one of the best factories, if not the best factory in Nicaragua. But it's because they've made a dedicated effort to pay attention to all the details. The more attention to detail you pay, the better the results will be at a factory. And the other thing that's very appealing about working with Hoya Nicaragua is the family that owns the factory. And factories are always a reflection of their owner. It reflects in who they hire. It reflects in how their people are treated in the factory. And Nicaragua is one of those rare factories that is actually Nicaraguan owned and Nicaraguan operated. There are no Cubans in the factory. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way towards Cubans. And this is something that I can't speak to in Brazil because I don't know, but I can tell you that in the Latino culture, it's a bigoted culture. I mean, just everything about it. There's your nationality. There is your social standing of where you are on the wealth ladder. There is the color of your skin, whether you're more Spanish descent, whether you're more Indian descent. It's a very stratified kind of scenario. And what I find that you don't have any of that at Hoya Nicaragua because it's a Nicaraguan factory owned by Nicaraguans, operated by Nicaraguans, and it gets rid of all of those inherent problems that are just part and parcel of the way Latins interact with one another. And I don't even know how this is going to translate. I have no idea what the little Cryocon subtitles are going to say, but I'm sure I'm going to get in trouble for saying this out loud. But the facts are the facts. And anyone familiar with the culture, and not in a critical way, but actually familiar with the culture, knows that what I'm saying is the truth. Now, obviously, as the world becomes smaller, and people become more educated. This is changing over time, but none of these things change quickly. And the other thing that's really good for people at Hoya is they're willing to take direction, and they're willing to give me what I want, even when they disagree with it. Because there are a lot of things that I do with my products that most factories will look at and go, that's crazy, that's unnecessary, why do, you know what I mean? And with Hoya, as long as I'm willing to pay for it, they'll do it. And that's very good. You know what I mean? That they're willing to work equally with me on these things. So they're a really, really good partner. And I really like I like who they are as people, and I like how they do business, and I like how they operate their factory. But the reality is you can make good cigars in any factory if you concentrate on the standards, the practices, the methodology. I always tell people those are the critical things. The other thing is to just be a dick at all times about those first things. You know what I mean? So if you're constantly staying on top, and it's one of the reasons why it's really unusual for someone like myself. Most brand owners in the United States, they visit these countries once a year, maybe twice a year. I try my best to go every single month for a week.
Wow.
Because except for the month of December, because the factories typically shut down at the end of the first week or by December 10th. So December is kind of a waste. But I try to spend as much time as I physically possibly can, because there's a difference between me being critical, sitting here on my ass, versus me being there with my eyes and looking at things and talking to people. And, you know, it makes a difference. It really does. And it's kind of like the child that you discipline. If you discipline them well when they're young, they don't need it when they're older. You know what I mean? They kind of learn. And I'm not saying that Hoya de Nicaragua needs to be disciplined. That's not what I'm trying to convey. But what I'm trying to convey is that consistency of always being there, always checking, always having high expectations. And yes, I'm more demanding than most people, but at the same time, I'm not unfair. I pay them my cigars that are made at Hoya de Nicaragua, and I also make cigars at another factory, Nicaraguan American. They are the best, they are the most profitable cigars they make in both factories. Okay, because I expect better, but I also am willing to pay better. And as a result, I also charge the consumer more. The consumer has to pay more for that. Now, the consumer gets to decide whether it's worth their money or not worth their money. If they don't think it's worth their money, they're not going to pay for that. Luckily for me, there's enough consumers that we as a company continue to grow. I mean, this year in the US, the market's a down market coming off COVID, but we're still up 40% year to date. Even in this market. We're arguably probably the fastest growing company right now. And that is not because of our brilliant advertising or our marketing. It's really just because the consumers like the product.
Steve, você enxerga a Nicarágua como a nova meca dos charutos?
Oh, absolutely. I don't even think there's a question about that. I think there was a watershed moment, and I even remember it as a smoker. I remember, and honestly, it was a Hoya de Nicaragua cigar. I remember when I smoked my first Hoya de Nicaragua Antaño back in the 90s, late 90s. And I was like, whoa, this is different. I mean, one of the things that's peculiar about me is most people on my side of the fence are very anti-Cuban cigar. I've never been that guy. I was a heavy Cuban cigar consumer for about 7 years. For about 7 years, I would say that probably 85% of the cigars I smoked were Habanos. And one of the reasons why I smoked Habanos was because most of the cigars in the United States market, with a few exceptions, cigars that Ernesto Perez Carrillo was making in Calle Ocho, he was making La Gloria Cubana, and he was making, what was that other brand? El Rico Habano, were strong. Rolando Reyes Sr. Out of Union City, New Jersey, was making a brand called Cuba Aliados that was a very strong, robust cigar. But most U.S. cigars on a 10-point scale, they were like a 2 or a 3. And most Cubans were like a 4 to a 6, okay, not the Querida, not the lighter Romeos, but they had cigars like Partagas and Bolivar, Ramoneones that I could get the type of satisfaction I was looking for.
Okay.
When I smoked those first cigars in the late 90s coming out of Nicaragua that were starting to be better made, it was like, whoa, like a light bulb. And that really changed things for me as a cigar smoker, as a consumer. And I'm now at the point where I pretty much smoke almost all Nicaraguan made cigars. And in the US market, I think it's gone this way. And we see it by the import numbers. And even the Dominican manufacturers, they're now bringing quite a bit of these heavier materials into the Dominican Republic and incorporating it into their blends. It's not all just Olor and, Pelado Cubano and whatnot, like it used to be, San Vicente. So there's been a shift there. And I think that there's just a lushness and a richness and a heaviness to the tobacco, even when the blend is mild. So like I make another Sobremesa called Sobremesa Brulee, Connecticut shade cigar, mild to medium. On a 10-point scale, I'd say it's like a 3, 3.5, right? But even in that mild cigar, there's a density to tobacco. There's a texture to the smoke. When you feel it in your mouth, it has a weight. You can almost chew on that smoke. You know what I mean? And that is something that you couldn't get. Now, on the flip side, in Cuban cigars have a floral note, a sweet floral note, particularly in the aroma, that I can't recreate. That is something that is inherent to their tobacco. But guess what? They can't make a Mi Querida. They don't have the materials to make that cigar. And whereas for me, Cuban cigars used to be the strongest cigars, I would say that most Cuban cigars today on a 10-point scale are between 4 and 6. Occasionally you'll get something, one of the regional releases, one of the darker wrapped, whatevers that'll push like a 7. But it's very rare that you can get a Cuban cigar that has the body and the richness of these Nicaraguan cigars. And as I said earlier, the Americans consume about 70% of the cigars, and Americans' tastes have changed dramatically. In the 50s, it was all super mild. In fact, everyone wanted to smoke jade wrap cigars, a double claros, the green, Candela. It's completely gone now it's a novelty item at best, right? I mean, Americans' tastes have greatly expanded into many more robust flavors. And part of this is the variety of ethnic food that we all get to enjoy now, okay, rather than the standard, Western European fare that, we were so known for. It's the same thing is true, with the whiskeys. Everybody likes higher proof in their bourbons. Everybody now is into single malt scotches and, those Islay scotches with their iodine and their peat and their saltiness. So the American palate has moved to be a much stronger across the board. You even see it in the potato chip aisle. I mean, you used to have plain potato chips, barbecue potato chips, sour cream and onion potato chips. And now we have wasabi ginger and we have ghost pepper and we have, all these crazy potato chip flavors, right? So the American palate has greatly expanded in the last 3 decades. And I think that the cigars that Americans are smoking, the cigars that we smoke today that we consider mild would be considered impossible to smoke 30 years ago. I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. A traditional Partagas, not a Cuban Partagas, but Dominican-made Partagas, in 1992 was one of the strongest cigars on the market. The cigar has not essentially changed. It's just we as consumers have changed. Today, on a 10-point scale, that cigar is a 3. You know what I mean? It's just, that's how much things have shifted. And I think we're seeing that internationally too. We're seeing this new generation of consumers wanting these more full, more robust, bigger experiences, and they can appreciate it. And the other thing too is not many people are like me that are smoking 10 cigars a day, right? Most consumers, they're getting 2 cigars a week. You know what I mean? So for them, they want it to be a much more lively experience. And that is something that Nicaraguan cigars supply. They supply a much, much richer smoking experience than many other cigars. And as a result, yeah, Nicaraguan, I think, has become the gold standard. And I think and you see it 30 years ago, non-Cuban cigars were 2 to 3% of the entire international market.
Yeah.
Today, they're already over 30%. And now with the shift in the Habanos distribution and the new price structure, that number is going to shoot way over 50, 55. Okay. But I think that was a natural trend line that was happening. Just the same way as in the United States, Nicaraguan cigars were a little teeny tiny sliver. It was Dominicans and then Hondurans and Mexicans. And now Nicaragua just dominates the numbers. And I think we're going to see that internationally too. And it just, yeah, I believe that the best cigars today are being made in Nicaragua. And I don't just say that as somebody that sells cigars made in Nicaragua. I say that as someone that actually smokes cigars. I really do believe that in my heart.
Uau. Fantástico. É, diretor, o charuto da Nicarágua, né? Acho que tá rolando aí, né? Pra gente já finalizar aqui, diretor, que temos um vídeo bem extenso, mas espetacular aqui para o pessoal que está assistindo a Cigar 019. Steve, no canal nosso a gente sempre tenta arrancar um spoilerzinho. Vem novidade do Steve Saka por aí?
Yeah, I mean, this is the part where it gets problematic. I talk about new products, but for you guys in the international market, who knows when you'll see them, right? So it's kind of one of those things. I mean, I'm almost sometimes my worst enemy because I make cigars across a wide array of spectrum. Like, I know that in Brazil, you guys are going to get Sin Compromiso. Sin Compromiso is an exquisite cigar, medium bodied, super creamy, really, really relaxing smoke. It has just a great flavor. It has a unique wrapper on it. I do this very special cultivation of San Andres Negro where we discard half the leaf, we strip it off the plant, and we don't use it at all. We don't even allow it to come to full fruition on the plant so that it can only focus on the top half of the plant, and it provides a much sweeter, richer style of San Andres Negro. So I'm always working on things. So I have quite a few new products, but I think you guys internationally, like, you guys haven't even been exposed to some of my most successful products. Querida and Tricky Traca and, in the Muestra de Saka line. That's a very interesting line of cigars. I mean, it's every cigar is unique. Every cigar is different. Everyone's a little personal challenge. So I think there's going to be a lot that's going to be new to a lot of the people in other parts of the world that people in the U.S. have already been enjoying for 3, 4, and 5 years. And a lot of this is my fault. I mean, we're just really small, and our sales are outpacing our ability to provide. I could rush to make more, but then aren't you shooting the goose that's laying the golden egg? I mean, there's a reason why you're doing so well. And just to rush to make more, to make short-term sales is a very flawed way of looking at things. I'm probably losing. I can tell you that, like, last year alone, I could have easily sold another $5 million in the United States market, but I just didn't have the product. Could I have taken leaf that wasn't quite 100% and made it, and it would have been 95%? Yes, I could have. But then you're kind of taking the magic away, right? That makes it different, makes it special, and makes it worth someone going out of their way. So I think for international, I think the thing that I would be looking for is for the international market to start smoking some of my broadleaf cigars, because that's the thing that I'm probably the most well known for, is broadleaf. And Mi Querida is a really great cigar, and Tricky Traca is maybe even a better cigar, depending on where you're on the strength spectrum. I think one of the things that's really interesting, though, about my cigars is even when I make stronger cigars, I don't tend to make pepper bombs. I tend to like cigars to be smooth. So I don't believe that a strong cigar has to bite you. I don't like cigars that bite. And part of that has to do with how I smoke. I don't like cigars that make me feel one and done-ish. What I always want when I have a cigar, a really good cigar. So one of my mentors was a man named Estelo Padron. Estelo Padron was the brother of the famous Jose Orlando Padron that everybody knows of Padron Cigars. There were two brothers in the beginning of the Padron Cigar Factory, and they had a falling out. Okay. And the one brother went his own way to work with a man named Frank Inesa in Honduras and Cofradía. And I was following Frank around in his factory for about a month, not Frank, but Estelo, for a month, just trying to learn and sponge. And at one point he goes, Saka, the most important thing you have to remember about cigars is this. He like slaps his chest. So me being young, what do I say? Passion. It's like, fuck that. No, not passion. What I want when I make a good cigar is that when the guy is smoking this cigar, that he's checking his pocket to see if he has the next one. Yep. That's a sign of a really good cigar. One that's really satisfying as you're smoking it, but it always leaves you wanting a little bit more. You wish it never ended. And I've always take that into consideration when I'm making these blends. But I always want it to have that kind of potato chip effect where you really just can't eat one or two out of the bag. You got to just keep eating out of the bag until there's no more. And then you go, man, I wish I had another bag. You know, that's what's, and that's part of the way I look at things when it comes to cigars.
Perfeito. E para terminar, quando teremos o Steve Saka aqui no Brasil?
Never. You guys are a long damn way away, man. I don't even go to California. Seriously, I'm going to California next week. It'll be my first time there in 5 years. I mean, this is part of the problem. Part of the problem is we're a small little company. I'm the tobacco buyer. I'm the blender. I create the brands. I do all the graphic design, and I know nothing about graphic design. Okay, literally, I'm an illustrator on this screen and in YouTube on that screen, listening to an 8-year-old kid try to explain to me how to use it. I mean, it's just I'm so very, very busy. Now, maybe as the company grows and we keep hiring more people, maybe I'll have the luxury of getting to travel to other places. But when you just think about, I have to go to the Dominican every year. I have to go to Ecuador every year. I have to go to Mexico every year. I have to go to Honduras every year. I have to spend time in the Connecticut River Valley twice a year. And then I have to be in Nicaragua pretty much 11 months out of the 12 months. And then you add in trade shows, that you're required to do, TPE, PCA, Dortmund. And then you have to actually, do all your work and run a company and everything else. There's not enough time to go and do the things that you would like to do. Eventually, would I make it to Brazil? I'd love to. But when, I have no clue. It's also part of one of the, and this is really odd too. We're probably one of the few companies that we don't actually solicit for sales. In other words, we don't actively go out and try to find people to buy our cigars. We kind of wait till they come and ask us, and then we're happy to have them as a customer, because we know, in the last 4 years, we've had to stop opening new accounts 3 times. Wow. I mean, the last time we didn't open a new account for over a year. We had over 200 accounts on a waiting list, of which we were only able to fulfill 75 of them in this last go around. So, we don't have the capacity to fulfill the current demand. And that's part of the problem with the international is not only do you, and this is what I always, if you talk to any of the international guys, they'll tell you, I'm the worst. I'm like, why are you buying my product? I'm giving you no discounts. I'm giving you no sales and marketing material. I'm giving you nothing to help you promote the brand in any way whatsoever. But guess what? it's not much different here. You know what I mean? I'm not going to California. I'm not going to, I mean, I've been in Arizona once in the last, it's one of our best markets, that greater Metro Phoenix market. I don't even know the last time I was in Texas, for God's sakes. And I don't, and it's not even that I visit the stores that are near me. I mean, if you ask the retailers here, they would tell you, no, we never see them. It's just, I'm just so busy. Eventually, yeah, I'd like to come to Brazil. I was like, what does even coming to Brazil mean? I mean, Brazil is so large. I mean, it's like, how do you go to Brazil for? I mean, to visit Brazil has to take a month, right?
More. Just is one state in 1 month. But the best of Brazil is the people.
And, you know, and the truth is, people are pretty much good everywhere, right? There's very few, but I mean, we sell cigars in so many countries that we have cigars in Angola and Dubai and Japan, and I'm always amazed by it that these consumers, and I guess this is the internet, right? The fact that we're doing a YouTube and consumers are going to get exposed, and that's what's changed everything, right? That the world's just become smaller as a result of our ability to communicate. But it's quite challenging. As a company, I don't really even feel like we're ready for international in any way whatsoever. And the bad part of it is, it means I'm already limiting my US market, and that means the international market even gets more limited. And I don't want anyone to confuse this. I want all of your money. I am greedy. I would love to make enough cigars to sell the whole world and nobody smokes anything but Dunbarton Tobacco and Trust. That would be fantastic. But it's just simply not a reality at this point. Maybe with time, maybe we get there. Who knows? It's hard to tell, but yeah, I don't think I'll be in Brazil in the next 3 years. I think that's a pretty safe bet.
Fantástico. Então, diretor, eu acho que estamos prontos para encerrar aqui a nossa entrevista, né? Eu acho que um bate-papo desse com o Steve foi fantástico, muita informação. E para você que chegou até aqui, então já é aquela coisa, se inscreve aqui no nosso canal, deixa seu like, porque assim nós traremos ainda mais pessoas. Steve, então, já que você não vai vir nos visitar, quem sabe num futuro próximo faremos uma segunda parte dessa entrevista que foi sensacional.
I never know if it is or isn't. I mean, I just talk.
Fantástico, fantástico. That's spectacular. Fantastic, amazing. Steve, thank you very, very much for coming here. For us, it's a very, very happy honor, whatever. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, and I hope the people that watch this. And this is long. We've been talking 2 hours. They're gonna be bored. It's gonna be a lot of reading. Yeah, the reading is gonna be crazy. And I gotta tell you, I feel bad for you. That's a lot of translating to do. That's a lot of subtitles to make.
Não, fantástico. Pra gente. Sim, sim. Muito, muito obrigado mesmo, Steve. Esperamos, de repente, no futuro, ter você aqui com a gente novamente, porque é muito legal ter as pessoas que estão envolvidas nesse mercado para falar com nós aqui do Brasil, que é um mercado novo e vem crescendo bastante.
Yeah, I think it's definitely good for us to, even though so much of the sales are in the United States, I mean, ultimately as a business, to be able to sell to a much wider, diverse audience ultimately makes the business more stable, more healthy. Because look, the United States, I don't know what your economic situation is now in Brazil, but the United States is probably going to go through a little bit of a rough patch. I mean, Europe is already seeing it now. So it actually helps to make the company healthier to be in more markets. So I know it's in our best interest, but it's balancing out the challenges with the needs and, the limited amount of resources that you also have to deal with. I mean, there are certain not, do you guys call them New World cigars in Brazil? What do you call them? What do you call non-Cuban cigars? How do you refer to them?
Cuban cigar.
Yeah, but not
No.
cigars.
In Brazil, off Cuba.
Off Cuba. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, there are certain U.S. brand owners that they really focus on international. Because the truth is, the international market is really underserved. I mean, for so many years, it was dominated by Cuban only. And look, love or hate, I don't think anybody could argue the Cubans are not exciting when it comes to making new cigars. I mean, what was the last new brand? Line extension of Cohiba for Mexique. Before that, you had San Cristobal and Vegas Robana. You know what I mean? You had Guantanamo get a little bit of a facelift. I mean, other than the occasional regional releases and the special editions, which are only for the really richy rich, right? You never ever see them unless you're super wealthy and you have connections. Most of the world has not been very well served with a wide range of product. And the other thing too is, for good or bad, Cubans have a very particular flavor and a very particular aroma. And it's really just kind of a variation of gray. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but there isn't a lot of really huge distinct differences. You can smoke a Diplomatico number 2 and you can smoke a Monte Cristo number 2. And I think if you smoke those blind and you smoke 10 of each, you would be very hard to get 10 for 10 as to what they are. Okay. I would argue that they're the same cigar in many cases. And the only reason they don't taste the same is because Diplomaticos were made at less factories and Monte Cristos were made at so many more factories. So Monte Cristos had a more variation in the range. So I think that as the international market gets to taste all of these different expressions that we have in the United States, I think they're going to even want more of it. Because as a cigar smoker, it's really nice. It's like, it's good to have that variety and that spice of life. And that is something that the off-Cuban market provides that the Cuban market doesn't. And another thing that's really changed internationally is, back in the day, international distributors never imported our best products. They always imported our worst products because they always felt as though Cuban cigars were always the pinnacle, and that served their premium consumer. So the only cigars that they would bring in were our cheap bundle Fuma grade product because they were selling it on the basis of price. So most international consumers never got to experience a top shelf off Cuban cigar versus a top shelf Cuban cigar. It was not ever a fair apple to apple comparison. It was always, okay, you had top shelf Cuban, and then you had everything that they were always taking our worst cigars because they wanted to hit the price. And I think this is where the internet and social media has changed things, is you see these cigar consumers and they're reading about all of these products and they're now interested in trying them. And another thing that I think is a bit of in the United States, if you want to smoke Cuban cigars, you can get Cuban cigars. I mean, we live in a free country. I mean, I live in a country where you can get heroin when you're in prison, right? So they can't control the import of a few Cuban cigars. So there's no consumer in America that, if they want to smoke Cuban cigars, can't get Cuban cigars. So I think that a lot of people in the United States, they've had the ability to do this comparison. Now, there are some consumers in the United States that have decided that they prefer Cuban cigars and they smoke almost exclusively Cuban cigars. But there's a lot more people that have decided, oh, I've smoked Cuban cigars and I've smoked off Cuban cigars, and I actually prefer the off Cuban cigars. And I think you're going to see more of that in the international market, particularly now with this crazy plan of Habanos's distribution and new price structure, being so focused on the Asian market. But I mean, let's not kid ourselves. We all knew the day that a Chinese investor group bought Habanos and Cuba tobacco that this is the way it was going to go. I honestly, though, did not think they were going to be so abrupt about it. I thought they would ease more into it. I did not think that they would shoot the prices as high as they shot them. I didn't think they would go to the Hong Kong standard. I didn't think they were going to shift so much distribution to one part of the world so quickly. It now has a lot of international distributors scrambling. I can tell you, just in the last 90 days, we've probably had 30 international inquiries because retailers are now saying, I've got to fill my shelves. What am I going to put on my shelf now that I can't get the Habanos that I used to get? And even if I can get what I get, it's still 30 to 40% more. Not counting Cohiba. The Cohiba prices are just nuts. How they could take Cohiba to the price point that he took it to, I don't even understand that. But I mean, but across the board, it's like a 30 to 40% increase in price almost overnight. And that's and it wasn't like the cigars were cheap to begin with. You know what I mean? So you were already at a very expensive cigar. And now, I mean, you're to the point now that there's many countries where you can't smoke a Cuban cigar for much less than 70, 80 American dollars. Once you go through the import and the taxes and the distribution, I don't know about you guys, but I don't make that type of jack. That would have me spending $700 a day to smoke cigars. I mean, my wife would divorce me in a heartbeat. Right? So I mean, that's not a reasonable standard. The number of people that can do that, and so it's going to be a very interesting next 5 years. But I think that internationally, I think consumers are going to start to get to experience a lot of the products that they've never had the joy of experiencing before. And I think that they're going to find that, wow, there's some real merit in them. And that a lot of the inherent biases that existed before, I think a lot of them are going to be shattered. It's going to take some time, but I think overall, I think people are going to be very pleased, you know, and I think that they're going to like, and hopefully the Cubans will reassess and realize that how stupid this idea is, and they'll kind of swing back a little bit. It's awful hard. It's hard that when you set the price here to now go tomorrow and set the price down. You know what I mean? It's one thing to go up in price, but it's a very hard thing to go down in price. And of course, regretfully, this Hurricane Ian is going to make their situation even far worse. I mean, I'm friends with a lot of people in Cuba still, and pretty much to a man, all of them took tremendous damage at the farm level. And we were already talking about a country that was really struggling on the agriculture side with the ability to grow and to provide the leaf they needed for their existing market. It's even going to be more challenging now. They got a rough road ahead of them. I mean, God bless them. I hope they find their way through it, because as a cigar consumer, I don't want Cuban cigars to go away, and I don't want them to be of lesser quality. I want to be able to still smoke a really good punch or a Ramon Ayone specially selected, or a little, Corona. I want that. So we'll see.
Sim, sim. Esperamos também aqui, o consumo dos off-cubas no Brasil cresceu bastante com esse aumento de preços dos charutos cubanos, mas a gente espera que também eles não sumam do mercado, certo, diretor? Certo. Porque, né, temos que ter aí variedades, né? E estamos muito bem servidos de opções aqui no Brasil hoje, certo ou não? Certo. Então, maravilha. Steve, one more time, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
No, my pleasure. And I appreciate everyone that watched this for, well, God, eternity. Thank you.
Fantástico. E para você que nos acompanhou até agora, aquela coisa, se inscreve aqui, compartilhe com todos os seus amiguinhos e amiguinhas. Em breve, mais novidades por aqui. Certo? Podemos ir, diretor? Está satisfatório todo esse conteúdo para o senhor? Amazing interview. Amazing interview. É uma coisa, isso é multilinguagem aqui agora. Galera, nós vamos ficando por aqui. Esperamos vocês nos próximos vídeos. Um beijo desse gordo que vos fala. Até breve. Tchau.